Frank Nitti was a small-built, pensive little man with ulcers and a nervous twitch. He was born in Agri, outside Palermo, in Italy, but avoided discussing his Sicilian background, always calling himself an Italian instead of narrowing down his place of birth. Nitti had gotten a full formal education in Italy before coming to the United States that gave him a working knowledge of advanced chemistry, and he was also said to be a talented watchmaker. Arriving at Chicago's enormous Italian ghettos by way of New York, Nitti worked as a barber in the city's immense Italian community. To earn extra cash, he turned to fencing stolen gems brought to him by his lifelong friend Louis Greenberg. It was Greenberg who introduced Nitti to an up-and-coming gangster, also from New York, named Al Capone. The newspapers referred to Nitti as the enforcer, but for those who knew the real story, the nickname was almost comical. In fact, as far as anyone knows, Nitti never killed anyone. He made his way up through the ranks of the syndicate because he was smart and cunning. While it was true that he would easily order a beating or an execution by the gangster squads he controlled, syndicate leaders rightly considered Nitti a nervous, jumpy, high-strung man, better suited, as Paul Ricco once said, to be the barber fence he started as. Unlike Capone, Nitti was a hard-headed businessman who kept his emotions intact and stayed at his desk from dawn to dusk. Nitti had few of the vices that burdened Capone's life. He didn't gamble, snort coke, drink, or keep girlfriends. He had no friends among the boys. In fact, the boys, the gangsters who made up the organization, had nothing but contempt for Nitti. Nitti wasn't popular because he was smarter, in every sense, than most of the men in the syndicate. Unlike Capone, Nitti was a colorless, dull, and humorless man, a stickler for details who spoke with a condescending, precise diction that gave off a cold attitude toward his subordinates whom he so openly despised. He was not a man prone to make mistakes or to leap into a project before he understood it. Nitti did research on the crimes he intended to commit. He clipped newspaper articles about the subject and studied them for clues. In the case of the Balaban brothers' extortion in 1934, Nitti scoured the financial sheets on the brothers' business and, according to Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, it was Nitti who planned the successful St. Valentine's Day massacre down to the last bloody detail. Nitti had done his time behind bars, having been caught up in the federal government's massive efforts to bust up the Capone mob. On March 24, 1930, Treasury agents formally charged and then arrested Frank Nitti with the crime of failure to pay his income taxes on an estimated $747,887 in income. The government claimed that Nitti spent $624,888 during 1925, 1926, and 1927, and it was their contention that since Nitti spent the money, he must have had the income to generate it, and therefore he should have paid $227,940 in income tax on that income. Capone tried to put in the fix for Nitti, but Congressman Billy Perillo, Capone's personal representative in Washington, reported that nobody in the Capitol was interested in taking fix money to save Nitti from jail. The highest levels of federal government wanted Capone and his organization done away with, and no one was going to get in the middle of that. In November 1930, Nitti's case was heard in federal court. The enforcer pleaded guilty and paid a $10,000 fine, which is what Nitti had agreed to in a plea bargain before sentencing. However, in a surprise move, at least to Nitti, he was sentenced to 18 months at Leavenworth. He would serve most of the term but got several months off for good behavior. It was a witch hunt inspired by distrust, fueled by outrage, and conducted by Midwestern blue bloods that were determined to find Nitti guilty of something. It was, as Capone said, open season on us wops. Nitti's army of high-priced lawyers had tried to pay his taxes, but the amount owed was never made clear to them because the indictment against Nitti was so vague as to be almost generic. Nitti, who was terrified of jail, offered to pay double what he thought the government said he owed, but they turned him down. No matter what Nitti said or did, he was going to jail. It was a railroad job, a miscarriage of justice perhaps, but the American people had grown tired of watching hoodlums like Nitti shoot up their streets and grow rich from it, and they wanted them in jail. Frank Nitti would draw the Chicago mob closer. Under his reign, it would become smaller and more tightly structured and profitable, and, as a result, better able to provide an income for its members. The federal government's attacks on Capone's syndicate had left it badly decimated, and Nitti, by way of attrition, was its new leader. Nitti won the bloody labor wars of 1932–33 for the Chicago mob and oversaw the gang's takeover of the Hollywood studios in the late 1930s. There were setbacks for Nitti, however. Mayor Anton Cermak and two other non-syndicate hoods, Teddy Newberry, a wild-card independent, and Roger Touhy, leader of a band of suburban bootleggers and mail robbers, entered a war with Nitti for control of the city's labor unions. In 1932, they decided to end the war early by shooting Nitti to death. At about 10 o'clock in the morning on December 20, 1932, two members of Cermak's special squad, Miller and Lang, were called to Cermak's office, where he handed them a slip of paper with Frank Nitti's name and office address. The two officers went to the massive office building and took the elevator to the 5th floor, room 554, where Nitti kept a cramped 3-room office. Nitti was furious, not at the raid, he was used to that, but for being interrupted in mid-sentence. He had grown that arrogant since Capone was gone. Miller and Lang ordered all the men in the room to turn and face the wall, their hands raised over their heads. A uniformed officer named Callahan, who was recruited by Miller and Lang outside the building just before the raid, recalled, Miller or Lang said we'd better frisk them, so I searched Nitti first and then Miller frisked him again, which I didn't like at all. I saw that Nitti had a slip of paper in his mouth. I told him to spit it out. He didn't, so somebody punched him in the stomach and then I took the paper out of his mouth for him. Lang then brought Nitti into another room and searched him again. Then he brought him back out and pushed him to me and said, where did he get that paper from? Frisk him again. Then Lang told Nitti to turn around and face the wall like the others. When he did, Lang grabbed Nitti's wrists. When I bent down to grab Nitti's ankles and Lang fired 5 shots into Nitti. I leaped back. Lang still had Nitti by the wrists. Nitti staggered toward the door and then he stopped and looked at Lang and he said, what's this for? And Lang shot him again. Then Lang walked to an anteroom and fired a single shot. When he came back out he was shot through the hand. Nitti looked up at the officers and said, oh God, save me. Save me this time, God. He had been shot in the neck, back leg and groin. He was taken to Bridewell Hospital where his father-in-law, Dr. Gaetano Rango, was called in to care for him. After several hours, Dr. Rango emerged from the operating room to announce that Frank Nitti would probably die before the night was over. But Nitti lived, one of the many mistakes that the Cermak forces made in shooting him. Within months, Tony Cermak was gunned down in Florida, Newberry ended face down in a mud puddle in Ohio, and Roger Touhy was framed on a trumped-up kidnapping charge. Later that year, Nitti led the Chicago mob, with fractions of the New York families, in an ill-fated attempt to extort millions of dollars from the Hollywood studios. When the coup failed, Paul Ricca told Nitti that since Nitti had dragged the outfit into the mess with his expansionist dreams, he was going to have to take the dive on this one. Nitti was terrified of going to jail. He had a phobia about it. At age 59, Nitti's life was a mess. He was clinically depressed. His wife, and a plain and innocent woman, had died in 1940 and Nitti never seemed to recover from the blow. He wore black almost every day for the little time he had left on this earth. True, he had remarried the former secretary to Ed O'Hara, the gambler who had turned evidence against Capone during his tax trial, but it was an unhappy marriage. The day before the indictments from the Hollywood extortion mess were handed down, Nitti called a meeting at his house. But, before Nitti could call the room to order, Paul Ricca took the floor and said, Frank, you brought Brown and Byoff and us into this thing, you masterminded it, and now it's gone bad. Ricca told him he would have to take the fall for all of them and go to jail since the federal government wanted a big name. Nitti started quoting law to him as to why he could not take the fall alone. Ricca lost his temper and started screaming at Nitti, who in turn lost his temper. Both were screaming, until Ricca ended it by saying, you better watch it, Frank, you're asking for it. At that point Nitti realized that he was no longer in charge of the mob. Silently, he walked to the front door and held it open for them to leave his house. Later that evening, Tony Accardo, then just a mere captain, called Nitti and told him that he and Ricca wanted to meet him the next night in the Loop. On the day Nitti was scheduled to meet Ricca and Ricardo to discuss the pending indictments, Nitti began drinking at lunch, and by the time of the meeting a few hours later, he was drunk and incoherent. He had reason to drink. He had been stealing money from the extorted cash taken from the Hollywood moguls, a fact which was sure to come out during the upcoming trials. When it did, he was a dead man. Drunk, Ricca made it to the meeting. Disgusted, Ricca called an end to the meeting and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving Nitti there to drink some more. Later that evening, Frank Nitti was seen staggering across a vacant lot. Some railroad workers who watched him saw him stagger badly and then fall to the ground near a fence. The engineer and fireman of a freight train watched Nitti weave down the middle of a track, a bottle in one hand and a pistol in the other. He aimed the gun at his head, pulled the trigger twice, but only managed to shoot a hole in his brown fedora. The third shot went into his left temple, the bullet exiting through his right